Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hey, this is Aaron. I just wanted to do a quick PSA just to let you know that our podcast is actually looking for a new intro song. We're looking for about an original 30-second brass band composition. If you happen to be chosen, we'll invite you to be featured as a guest on a bonus episode of the podcast, as well as you will get credit at the end of every podcast. So, if you're a composer or you're interested in maybe trying to compose for this, we have bands to record it. We just need the composition. So, if you're interested, please email submissions to Amy at amyschumakerbliss@gmail, AMYSCHUMAKERBLISS@gmail. And if you need that information, you can also find it on our website, newworldbrass.com. But yeah, we thought it would just be great to feature some brass band music in the beginning of our podcast and as the exit outro. But as you can imagine, when I was putting this together initially, there's not a lot of just like brass band music on free-to-use podcast music websites. So hopefully we can find a great submission for you guys. I'm looking forward to all of your submissions. And anyway, let's get on with the show.
Okay, so we usually start off with just kind of some banter, kind of what's been going on. So Tony, you have to find a rehearsal space, you said, because you only have everything with a drum set at this point, right?
Yeah, we just did a concert. It was the only we had other percussion there, but I programmed things that use just percussion or just drum set. And we added some other percussion, just for the gig, and they came to the last rehearsal and just kind of saw how things were going and took some notes and then just read the gig. I have a really, really good timpani player that, can pretty much just drop in any given moment. And she did a great job of just filling in at the last second. It's a shame that we can't have them there for all the rehearsals because it's just logistically too tough to get all the equipment from our storage shed to a rehearsal site, Sure. But we have to find a place somewhere that has a band room or something that has a percussion set up for us. And I probably have about 3 more weeks to solve that problem before we get to the critical mass point where we're not going to be prepared for the next concert. It's really a mess. It's, that, people are scared to allow outside groups come into their buildings now, or just don't want to assume the risk.
That's right. Yeah, it's happening everywhere, Tony, I'm sure. So, yeah, and bands are putting their seasons on hold or not really projecting until they know for sure. So, and that's understandable. So we'll weather it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, we're going forward. We're planning to go to the contest in Huntsville, and we're going to go after it and solve problems as they come up.
Absolutely.
Well, Tony, I think we have an awesome guest host with us today. Do you want to introduce him?
Yeah, sure. So this is Dr. Ron Holz. He is a founding member of the Lexington Brass Band and one of the early bigwigs with the North American Brass Band Association, and pretty much wrote the book on the history of Salvation Army's music programs in the United States. So I figured, who better to talk to about brass banding in the United States and North America than this guy, because he's been there, seen it all, and is part of the legacy of brass banding here. So I think that what we should probably start off with, Dr. Holtz, is talk to us a little bit about your family background and how you got into brass banding.
Sure. My father was the director of the New York Staff Band and the territorial music secretary in Manhattan when I was growing up in northern New Jersey. My training in brass came in the home. We had a little family band. All my family played brass instruments and we sang. Plus, at our local church, what the Salvation Army calls a corps. We had a very nice youth band, and that I began playing in probably about age 7 or 8. But my father traveled all over the Eastern United States as a guest trainer and, of course, trying to, shall we say, rally the troops. So every summer we went to multiple music camps and then ended up at the famous Star Lake Music Camp where my father was the program director. So I was constantly involved as a young rising cornetist in brass band music. That was my legacy. That was my what I did. And if the New York Staff Band was doing something in the city, we went in and heard it. I didn't, of course, go on all the trips they had, but that kind of thing. Or if they went to sometimes to Maine to say Old Orchard, which is south of Portland, for a big convention, sometimes families would join. So I was involved in brass banding from a very young age and just grew up in that culture. And we had very, very fine experiences in that situation. So that's the background for me. And then by the time I was a young teenager, when my father was moved to Hartford to be a more of a church administrator, I began to take on leadership role in my local band. So I began conducting and leading at a very young age. And I had a lot of conducting experience. Before I even got to university, I was already doing a lot of conducting, score reading, things like that. So I really got into it. Okay.
How would you say that the New York Staff Band compared to now from the back in the day? Is it the same quality of band? Was it a really good band, or has it grown in quality as the years progressed and directors changed?
Well, I think there's several ways to answer that question. First of all, the band nowadays has incredible technical facility, very fine young players, and they play very, very well under Derek Lance. So let's kudos to Derek as he took over for Ron Wakesnorth. No easy assignment, because Ron brought them to a very, very high level. But the band under my father, let's just say that was the first peak of the New York Staff Band. And you can hear it in their unedited recordings and in their trip, for instance, their big tour of England in 1960. You had Phil Smith's father, Derek, as the principal cornet or the soloist. It was an amazing band in many ways. Did they match the band of nowadays in technical facility? Probably not. Did they match them in terms of musicality? Yes, I would say they did. I think they played with refinement and elegance. But again, at their level, and of course, the band got gradually better and better. Vernon Post took them to another level. Derek Smith, they had very fine conductors in there. Brief stint with Brian Bowen, and then of course Ron's long period of leading. So the band of my father's, and he was deputy for a long time, but he actually led it from about 54 to 63, was a very fine band and played with great musicality and elegance. Whether they were as technically as precise as the new bands, I doubt that. But on the other hand, remember, the new bands sit on the shoulders of those old bands, you see, right. And they can listen to the recordings. They can be part of that heritage and claim that, shall we say, that, I guess you would call it somehow their DNA, okay, musically. And so I would say the band is doing very, very well under Derek. But the band under my father was a very, very fine band.
Yeah, that's great. Do you think that those recordings that you talk about, like from the 1960 tour, are those available anywhere? Have they made their way to YouTube yet? Or
there are some there. There are some, for instance, if you get my book, The Proclaimers, which is the revised history of the New York Staff Band, there's a CD insert that takes you from the first extant recordings from 1922 right up into Ron Wakesnorth's era. and you can hear the bands of that period. You also, some of those old recordings, the staff band put on CD. For instance, if you want to hear an amazing recording of Derek Smith playing Stedman Allen's Rhapsody in Negro Spirituals, or some of his early recordings like Songs in the Heart, some of these early recordings were revisited and put out in CD format. So you can track a lot of that, both in my books, but also on the staff band website. You should be able to track that down.
Oh, good. How many books have you written?
Oh, wow. It's about 6 or 7 so far, I think, Tony. I don't know. I guess I can start counting them. New York Staff Band, 2 editions, Heralds of Victory and Proclaimers. My 2-volume study of the Salvation Army bands worldwide, called Brass Bands of the Salvation Army, the Mission of Music. I wrote a recent book in 2016 on the gathering of the 5 top bands out in Long Beach, California. I did a life study of Eric Lightson, which is mostly about his wind and brass band production. I don't know. I'm sure I'll forget. By the way, and I've done nearly 100 compact disc notes booklets.
Liner notes.
For bands, you name it, New York Staff, International Staff, Black Dyke, Rhymethorpe, Brighouse, Enfield, you name them. I've done notes for those bands.
Sure. That could be a book in itself.
Yeah.
Let's kind of jump back and talk about the books you were just mentioning about, the development of brass banding in the United States, because that the books that you talk about were the Mission in Music and how Salvation Army brass bands came to the United States and how they developed. I think is a pretty fascinating topic because it directly relates to how we see brass bands today. So talk to us a little bit about what's in those books and how the development of brass bands through the Salvation Army came here.
Sure. Well, you have 2 things running parallel when the Salvation Army begins to use bands for its street missions in the 1880s. Now, the New York Staff Band becomes established in 1887, but there are some earlier efforts prior to that. Well, you have 2 things working. One is the American tradition itself. Remember, in the 1880s, you may have had, I think it's the Smithsonian Institute book that projects about 10,000 village bands existing around that time. So you have that is the popular music of its day. Well, the Salvation Army comes in, and as people join the Salvation Army, many of them are town bandsmen. They bring that background. So in the early days of the New York Staff Band, for instance, trumpeter Trumbull, who led it for a short time, he was a very fine cornetist in the Elyria, Ohio town band. So you have that tradition. On the other hand, you have the British tradition of people who are emigrating, who come over or are sent over to be part of the Army's early mission. So those 2 traditions blend, okay, in the early going. Boy, wouldn't it be fun to have recordings of a band from 1892? Our earliest extant recordings in the United States come from early 20s. It would be fun, but we have certainly lots of pictures and accounts of what the bands prior to that played. And I talk about it in both my Brass Bands of the Salvation Army and in my history of the New York Staff Band. So you have these 2 traditions side by side. 1, the American brass band tradition, and 2, the British tradition, and they are blending. And of course, at the time the Salvation Army is developing its bands across the country, America's brass bands are morphing into wind bands. And of course, the tradition that takes off becomes the wind band, a la Sousa, a la others of that ilk from the 1880s and 1890s. But the Salvation Army maintains its brass band roots. By the way, the early Salvation Army bands did have woodwinds. And for instance, the early New York staff band sported some clarinets and an occasional flute and piccolo. By the 1920s, they tried to have a full saxophone section. And in some ways, they were ambivalent about whether they wanted to be American or British. Okay.
Yeah.
It took until the 1930s for Bruce Broughton's grandfather, the old Brigadier William Broughton, to banish the woodwinds and establish a true all brass band. Now remember, Broughton himself, old man Broughton, he is a British emigre, so he's going to bring that tradition. But the instruments themselves are very American. Bell front baritones and euphoniums, bell front altos, long modeled cornets with very bright sounds. It's not until the 1950s that my father begins to seek out compensating bass and baritones, euphoniums, and tubas of matching variety. You can look at the early pictures and you can say, what an amalgam, what an incredible mixture. And eventually, it's interesting, as we became more American in what we did and how we played, our instrumentation became more British. So there's a bit of an irony there, okay? For instance, my dad wanted the cornets to be a little more blended. Well, a lot of the guys were playing these long model cornets, which were kind of a compromise between a trumpet and a cornet. Well, my dad brought Derek Smith down from Canada to be a soloist and eventually convinced the entire section to play what we would call now shepherd crook cornets with deeper mouthpieces. And so that changes. The altos are no longer bell front, which, some of the recordings, I don't know how they got a good sound out of them, but they did. Quality altos, quality baritones, quality euphoniums. So it took time. It took time, but you were changing a balance. Now, what was more likely in America was the size of the bands. My dad always swore by 4 baritones and 6 altos, 2 on a part, rather than the contest variety.
Right.
And in the trombones, at least 4. Now, you may know that the Salvation Army was always publishing music for 4 or more parts, up to 5. Okay, whereas the contest scores only 3.
Yeah.
So there was that difference. Okay, and the New York staff band of the 50s and 60s had a very warm sound. In fact, it's interesting, when they traveled to England in 1960, what you have to remember is American bands had been on Stuttgart pitch, or what we call standard 440, since the 20s, when the US military adapted to that. Okay, they followed all the military bands that they met in World War I, except the Brits initially. Now the Brits, the wind bands of Britain eventually also changed the Stuttgart pitch. The brass bands stayed to high pitch, way up into the late 60s. So for instance, when the New York staff band would be heard in 1960, it would be heard warmer, okay? And psychologically, it's lower. They're playing at 440. The British bands are playing at about 458. Now,
Wow.
Problem is they can't really play together.
Yeah.
You understand? It's diabolical if you think about it. Eventually, the Army in Great Britain provided income for the bands to eventually add tubing until such time as they could move the instrument factory and Besson as well to what we would call low pitch, okay? And that happened in the mid to late 60s. So there was an interesting transition there. But if you heard the New York staff band back then, they would have sounded, well, to the British, they wouldn't have sounded as bright. You see, they would have sounded a little more mellow. And of course, my dad used lacquer finish back then, whereas the Brits used, the old silver band idea. And psychologically, maybe it even sounded different. But I think one of the other important distinctions there, by the way, when Ed Gregson heard the New York staff band play in Royal Albert Hall in 1968 under Vernon Post. That is available. An amazing performance of Derek Smith doing the last two movements, the Hummel, and the band playing the Canadian folk song suite by Morley Calvert, who, by the way, we did use as a judge a couple of times at NABA. And Ed Gregson said, boy, I like this band because they don't wallow in vibrato. You see, now that's the other thing that the Americans brought. They had gradually, and you can see this in our wind band soloists as well, our American tradition less emphasized vibrato as an omnipresent thing, but only something to be used as an ornamental activity. Whereas the brass bands of Great Britain held on to that vibrato for a long time. Many of them still do, you know, if you still listen to them carefully. Although the best bands, the top bands, they can turn it off, you know, easily. And when I've judged the Open or I've judged All England, you know, the top bands are able to adapt their ornamental, style to whatever is called for. If it's a more modern work, they're not going to put a lot of super vibrato in there, you see, except as appropriate. But yeah, our American bands began to shall we say, dismiss vibrato as an omnipresent device years before the British. We used to call it fruity, Tony, fruity sounds. Okay,
we called it washer machine vibrato.
Well, yeah, I mean, think of Nick and Bob Childs years ago. Those guys were amazing, but they played with real fruit, you see. And when Nick wants, he can ask Black Tie to give that. But Bob's son, who's now at North Texas, man, David can turn off that fruity style in a nanosecond if he wants to, and play straightforward style. Again, depending on what the style of the music is. So, if you're doing some early 30s and 40s test pieces, or even up through early Eric Ball, certain kinds of vibrato are very, very appropriate. Later works from Gregson on, I don't think it applies. In fact, Ed Gregson would get after you if you started to play fruity in his music. So you know what I'm saying? He would not want that, you see. So that kind of thing. So that's a perspective of that. And I've seen our NABA bands, by the way, Tony. Let's talk NABA bands too. I've seen that same tradition of NABA bands. If they had vibrato style early on, they gradually got rid of it quickly and only applied it as necessary. So if you came to a NABA contest, even in the late 80s, early 90s, you would hear our NABA band sounding very much American, okay, and less British. Nowadays, of course, because our test pieces are so as much oriented to European and American music as to British, it's appropriate for these bands to play with a very, we used to use the term symphonic style, Tony, whether that's accurate or not. I mean, you remember when you were a member of my Lexington brass band, sometimes I despair because the guys wouldn't do any vibrato. They would play straight. And I said, now can we warm this up a little bit there?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? At a particular point. On the other hand, most of the time, that's what I preferred, a straight sound, a straight symphonic sound. Not unlike a brass choir, but the blend was different.
Yeah.
Orchestral horns and trumpets versus the sax horn family, cornets, flute, and soprano. So, hey, I'm talking a lot. You may have other things.
Well, I do, since we were talking about vibrato, you would probably be the perfect person to ask this, boys, but what are the origins of group vibrato in British brass bands? Does it go, and what's the purpose that it developed? Because it had to start for a reason.
I think it's always been there. I mean, if you think about it, the same thing is true in orchestral playing. The left hand of the string player, okay? The rate, okay? And I think that as a popular style in the brass bands of the 19th century in Great Britain, it was just what they did. In other words, some used hand vibrato, other used chin vibrato. It was thought to be what you did. Same thing with operatic singers. You see, it was something that you did. On the other hand, you can read Mahler's comments about when I want vibrato and when I don't. You see, one of the famous quotes of all time is Vaughan Williams in his Ninth Symphony. He writes a flugelhorn part. It's wonderful. In the second movement, it features a soloist, but in the score notes, he says, "No vibrato allowed. We do not," I'm paraphrasing here.
Right.
"We don't want the flugelhorn to wallow in the excessive vibrato it is allowed to do in the brass band." Now that's late 1950s, you see.
Yeah.
But remember, Vaughan Williams is writing for brass bands. He loves brass bands, but he also knows that that vibrato had been a part of the style for, 80, almost 100 years.
Yeah.
What started it, I think it was not only British brass bands, Tony, I think it was part of the entire European performance pattern. But as styles changed, as music changed going into World War I, the sentimental vibrato style gradually was gotten rid of as appropriate, depending on the piece. There are recordings, for instance, of the New York Philharmonic under Mahler in 1911. You can hear that schmaltzy playing and sliding and portamento, and you can hear when he wants the vibrato and when he wants it straight. So I think eventually the British have learned to use it as an ornament, but back then it was what you did. You see, how do you explain it? I'd say it was a cultural phenomenon across the board, and brass bands, being very much music of popular people, it embraced it very much. You see,
Yeah.
Particularly opera. I mean, think of what they were playing. What did a typical brass band play in the 1880s and 90s, even at the British Open? They did opera excerpts.
Yeah.
Of course, they did marches, and they did big selections from classical pieces. So they would normally imitate what the orchestras were doing. And how do you imitate a left hand of a violin or a cello? Well, you imitate it with your hand or your lip. So I just think that's where that comes from.
Do you think there's anything to the fact that, like, anybody who's had any experience playing Civil War brass instruments and Civil War bands know that those things are the devil to play in tune?
They are.
Do you think that the vibrato was probably also a tool because in the 19th century, the development of the instruments, they were tough to play in tune. So the vibrato kind of obscured that a little bit and made it sound more in tune.
Well, that's very possible, because vibrato is nothing but a waving between pitches.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what vibrato is, you see. And vibrato can be judged by how fast and how big, right? And so I would say that, I mean, I played with saxons as a ringer on tenor horn, alto, diabolical. And but in that band, Dave Henderson doesn't want you to do too much vibrato. When Dave was the musical manager there, of course he played beautiful baritone horn, but I think that's part of the answer. I think it's more cultural than intonation, personally. That's my perspective. But yeah, those old instruments, they are diabolical to play in tune. So vibrato can help. But on the other hand, Tony, if you've ever tried to tune people that play with a vibrato, I mean, it's a shooting match. What note do you choose? Which part of the tune? When I tell you, when I work with amateur groups, and I go to do tuning, and I hear that shaky vibrato, I just know I have to be gentle.
Yeah.
Because they have no control.
Yeah.
They have no control.
I do have to pipe in with a funny story here real fast. On my CD, I did I did a movement of a piece called Hatshepsut, and it was supposed to be, the Egyptian pharaoh.
Right,
And we were supposed to make it sound like an ancient horn.
right.
So I thought, how do I make it sound ancient and just kind of like, with our modern instruments, it's almost impossible to make it sound like that. So
Sure.
I grabbed a Civil War era baritone and I let it go where it goes.
Yeah.
And it sounded fantastic. It sounded so otherworldly in that context. And then I tell you, still today, I have people coming up to me years later saying, your CD sounds wonderful, but why were you so out of tune in that one movement?
Of course.
Oh,
Of
because
course.
some people just didn't catch it. We tried to turn up the reverb. We made it sound otherworldly and kind of
Yeah.
distant and everything. And some people don't catch it.
No,
Oh, so
no.
every chance I get, I tell people. So everyone, that was a Civil War horn on my recording. That's why I'm out of tune.
Right. I want to say something here, Tony, about when we've been judging at NABA. I mean, back when I was controller too, but our judges have been very good at being kind and gentle, but at the same time suggesting changes. And when vibrato becomes a problem, we have been able to use our spoken comments to good account. Whereas in Great Britain, when you judge, you're just writing comments and you don't have time really to reflect on that. But in America, because we do a recording, we can from time to time on the side, and we've been doing it for decades, say, well, I'm not so sure that the band needs vibrato or the solo at that point. Maybe you could warm it up at that point, you see. So I think in some ways, NABA bands are in advance of some of the other world bands in terms of handling that. Although I noticed that the Norwegian bands are very good at managing vibrato as appropriate. Okay, and they do a very fine job. And of course, now the European bands that are the Austrians, the Germans, the Danes, the Swedes, they too are able to turn it on and off quickly. So that's just a side comment.
Yeah, that's always a topic that, the group vibrato, but there's also another thing that we do have to work on developing is the sonority of the band. And that's something that is very different between the British bands and here as well. So what can you talk about how the sonorities differ and how that's developed as well?
I think, as I said, one thing my father wanted to get out of the New York staff was this richer middle of the band, which is why he wanted to double those baries and altos or tenor horns. One thing that's taken our NABA bands a long time to get is a balanced middle, because the heart of the brass band is the sax horn sound. If your altos and baritones and euphoniums can't really open up their sound, they're going to be devastated by the cannons to the right and left of them. The trombones have only gotten bigger. The cornets have only gotten bigger. And of course, the tubas, Tony, you would know, for the most part in NABA, are not B's and E's. They're small C's, double C's, or sometimes F's. And that's a different sound. Ultimately, you would like the American sounds to be richer and darker, approaching what we get out of a top band like a Black Dyke or a Brighouse or a Foden's, or, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I don't want to discount what we do achieve in that. But the hardest thing, I think, in any American brass band is getting that middle of the band to step up to the plate, which also means sometimes the outer guys submitting, okay? One of the things that Eric Ball used to do years ago in his series, what's he call it? Anyway, he has a whole series about band training, was to use the middle of the band first and then let the brights and the tubas surround it, making sure that the brights didn't overwhelm. And that particularly has been true because back the older trombones and the older cornets were smaller board, okay? But now they're big board. You see, the trombones are indeed cannons. And you see, to try and get only 3 altos or 2 baritones to match that, those guys have really got to use a lot of air. Tubas don't seem to have quite the problem with that, other than maybe blending a little bit better. It can be a problem for the Cs to do that, but because of, in many ways, because of key alone, but because you have this B flat, E flat mixture. But I think the key issue in a brass band sound is, can you get the middle to hold its own with a rich, warm sound and balance the naturally louder instruments of the bright choir, cornets and trombones, and of course, the very heavy tuba sound, which has to be very careful not to overwhelm. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's just a perspective. I like to use hymn tune training for that because you can frequently make sure that the band plays, first of all, with just the mellows. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe adding the flugelhorn and then adding the brights and saying, okay, guys, what's your blend? You see, when do I want that bright sound to be matched? When do I want it to be on top? When do I want it to be underneath? And I think that's the thing that's the hardest thing for bands to do, is to get a balance between those 2 basic colors. Paul used to call it feminine and masculine, and we don't want to use those terms anymore, that the middle of the band is feminine and the outer limits are masculine. I think bright and mellow work better, okay? Those that play upright, and those that play straight out. I think that's better. So I think that's the big issue, regardless of what the style of the music is. And our more modern pieces really require flexibility in all sections. And yet we want those tenor horns and baritones and euphoniums to maintain their distinct sound. We don't want baritones sounding like euphoniums. We don't want alto horns sounding like trombones, you see. Right. But it's easy for them to do so if they force the issue, see?
Yeah.
And hey, this is a little side comment. There was Peter sent me, I'm not even going to mention the band here. They're a very fine band, but they were doing a test piece. And in one of the videos, you could see that they used a first horn to cover a flugel part for intonational reasons and sound reasons. In other words, they weren't supposed to do that. And NABA, we have a controller that can go, nope, that's wrong. We say only the instrument required. But in Great Britain, the judges don't see anything. We're behind a curtain. And if you want to, you can cheat. And you can have that flugel, if it's a low register, played by a first horn who can adjust the sound a little bit to make it sound like a flugelhorn.
Yeah.
So there it is on the video. This was a prize winner, by the way, cheating to get a proper sound, you see.
Yeah.
And, but you know what? They played so well. They deserved to win. But I'm saying it was just for one phrase, and they decided to change the color a little bit, and nobody knew the difference. At least the judges didn't.
No,
nobody would have known that unless you had seen the video.
Yeah.
You're following the score and you say, wait a minute, who's doing that?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of rearranging of things.
Absolutely.
In the contest. They do a lot of that now. We actually changed the NABA rules where that's allowed too as well here.
That's right.
We just did, it's more like an enforcement thing for us, because up until the advent of live streaming, nobody would ever know any of that. But now that we have live streaming, somebody's going to like, hey, wait a minute, that flugel's supposed to be playing that. Why is the tenor horn playing that? That's against the rules, and we're going to have a whole bunch of
exactly. In the old days when I was controller, we did monitor that. Okay.
Yeah.
I sat out with the score, and we rarely had anyone try tricks. It was
Yeah.
usually the first trombone playing the baritone part or vice versa on a very exposed part, but it was only occasional. And, you know, I don't think we ever had to, shall we say, discipline. Let's say we chastened a few bands that way. I mean, it goes all the way back to Harry Mortimer. There's a famous story. There's a test piece by Henry Giel, who had an important influence on Eric Ball. It was called Oliver Cromwell. Starts out on the soprano on his high G, which for the solo cornet would be a high C. Well, Nerve City.
Yeah.
And the guy couldn't do it. But you know who played it at the contest and won? Harry himself on the end chair. Foden's came in and played it, not on the soprano, but on the solo cornet.
Yeah.
See? And again, the judges didn't know. They're hidden. They're behind they're behind the veil, so to speak.
Yeah. So they'll never know.
I mean, it's been going on for decades, And the key is, are you making music or not? You see, are you making music? That's a key issue. By the way, I can tell you some fun stories about judging over there when you have to be veiled. I tell you, the fun story came from my good friend from Sweden, Per Olsen. Per was for years a fine conductor. He got tinnitus and only lives choral groups now, but he was a wonderful conductor. And he judged in the Royal Albert Hall once in a lower section, and his English was not good. Okay. So they put you in this cubicle. Okay. And he had to go to the bathroom. And he tried to tell these guys, I need to get out. Well, he couldn't really communicate well, except, shall we say, with rather obvious gestures. Well, the guy there, the usher, handed him a chamber pot. He wasn't allowed out. He had to go on the chamber pot and pass it through. And I had that same experience at the All England back in the late 90s or early 2000s. My first judging in Cambridge, we got into the veil, and old Philip Biggs, who's now gone to glory, that great editor of the Brass Show, he and his friend Richard, he said, "No, Ron, we have a chem toilet for you here." I said, "A chem toilet?" He said, "Yeah, you just kneel by this thing if you have to go. We don't let you out." And I'm saying, "What?" And then Steve Sykes, who's one of the other judges, he's laughing at me. I had just proceeded to have like 2 extra coffees, okay, to keep sharp. And the other 2 guys are laughing at me. They said, "Ron, you're in trouble." And, they wouldn't let you out back then. So I had to, there's people right behind you, and they can hear you going to the bathroom. So it's just crazy. Now, nowadays, at the Open, you get a judge's interval. You get a brief. And of course, we've done it at NABA for years, allowed the judges, a potty break. But yeah, back then, man, they didn't let you out. They sequester you from first thing in the morning until the end of the day.
Gosh.
You see, but nowadays, at least they let you go to the John.
When I was judging the youth section a few years ago, I got to tell you, I was I don't know how many months pregnant.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, I didn't drink anything.
Right.
Because when you're pregnant and you have to go,
I know.
You gotta go.
That's right. Exactly. So, but we're a little less barbaric than we used to be. We give them breaks now.
Yeah.
Wow.
Meal breaks and bathroom breaks are,
Absolutely.
The show does not have to go on.
Exactly.
Without those. That's really funny.